So we are in Esther chapter 2, continuing in Esther chapter 2. We'll be at verse 21 to begin with. And as we said in our introduction to the book of Esther a few weeks ago, the book of Esther reads a lot like a fairy tale, doesn't it? I mean, you have this beautiful young woman of a repressed people that unexpectedly becomes exalted to the position of queen of the land. And so she's a hero in the story, but there's another hero in the story also we're going to see today, and a villain. We're going to see a villain today as well. And of course that theme of heroes and villains is very popular in entertainment. You know, you pick almost any book off the shelf or movie, off of some streaming service, and it's probably going to have a hero and a villain contained within, because that battle between good and evil just really appeals to us, doesn't it, for entertainment. And Esther gives us a view into such a battle between good and evil, a real battle that took place all these years ago, and how it was won. And so first of all today, let's see how another hero emerges here in the book of Esther. Look at chapter 2, verse 21. It says, "In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence." And so we see this plot that's sort of emerged. I said we're going to see a hero emerge, but there's this plot that emerges first of all, and that is this Bigthan here, Bigthan and Teresh. And Bigthan is not the Big Tha of chapter 1. It's a different person. Their names are very similar, but different people. And these are these two of the guards for the king, and they've decided they're going to assassinate him. That's their plot here that has emerged. And why they want to do that, we don't know. We know they're angry. We don't know what angered them. And how they're going to do this, we don't exactly know all those details either. But certainly they would have had opportunity as these trusted servants who guarded his gates and so forth, guarded the door for him. You know, during World War II, they had a saying that loose lips sink ships. And that's what happened with these guys, isn't it? Their loose lips sank their ship, right? People found out what they were planning to do. And most importantly, Mordecai learns of this, and Mordecai takes action. Mordecai indirectly has the king's ear because of his cousin, who's his adoptive daughter, Esther, now being queen. It seems unlikely that Mordecai would have been able to help in any other way. How else would he have gotten a word through to the king except for his Esther is in that position now? And so really we see the providence of God at work here already in the book of Esther. The deliverance of the Jews is going to involve Esther and Ahasuerus. We're going to see that in coming weeks. But that won't happen if Ahasuerus himself is dead. And so Mordecai happens to hear of this plot and then has a path to warning Ahasuerus through his adoptive daughter, who's been providentially placed there as queen next to the king. And so in God's providence, Ahasuerus himself has his life spared. And Mordecai is a hero, isn't he? He's definitely a hero in this account. So often the hero is just that person who takes action when others do nothing. You know, that defines what a hero is. You know, 9/11 is a painful memory for our country. 9/11 from 2001. I don't even have to define it. I just say 9/11. We automatically know, all of us who lived through it especially, what that means. And we immediately think of the two planes that hit the World Trade Center. And we think of the third plane that crashed really kind of in front of the Pentagon, thankfully. Didn't actually get a direct hit as they were aiming for. But there was a fourth flight, and that was Flight 93, that crashed in rural Pennsylvania. And that flight took off a little bit later than all the others. It had a little bit of a delay in its takeoff, and I'm sure all of us who've traveled by plane, that's happened to us once or twice or every time, that the plane takes off a little bit late, right? And that's what happened with them. And because of that, because they took off late, word of the previous hijackings and crashes had become known while they were still in the air and before the hijackers really had started to do all of their diabolical plans here on that flight. And so when the hijackers took control of the plane, the passengers on Flight 93 didn't just sort of, ride it out. They took action. In previous times where hijackers would take control of a plane, they did so to raise a ransom or because they wanted someone released or something like that, right? They were going to hold those attendants or those people on the plane as hostage. But that wasn't what was happening here. And that was clear because it was all over the news already, and the people on the flight heard that. And so when they heard that, they decided, we're going to fight the terrorists. And that's what they did. Now, tragically, they died. They did not live through this, but in doing so, they prevented an attack that was intended for our Congress building that would have led to many more deaths than the 94 on board. You can imagine, a plane crashing into, such a populated area in Washington, D.C. alone, but then the Congress building on top of it. And so heroes take action, don't they? That's what heroes do. That's what they did on Flight 93, and that's what Mordecai did here. They took action. And I hope none of us are ever in a place like the people were in Flight 93, of course. But we do all find ourselves in Mordecai's place at times. We find ourselves in his place where heroism means just using our mouth. Being willing to speak up. Speaking up for what's right. Speaking up for someone who's been wronged. Or even someone who's in danger, like Ahasuerus was in danger, and he said something to make sure that he knew about that and his life would be spared. I pray that when those opportunities come for us to be that hero because we use our mouth, that we will do so by God's strength, right? That we won't just sort of kind of drop back and be silent or be shy or whatever, but we'll speak up when God's leading us to do so. Because Mordecai did so, the king was saved. And these conspirators were captured instead of them being able to orchestrate their plan. Esther then also is involved, and without revealing, her relationship to Mordecai, we trust she's still keeping that a secret as he asked her to do. She passes word to the king, but is sure to give Mordecai the credit. This is the man who brought this information forward, and it's recorded as so, it tells us, and that's going to be important in the coming weeks as we continue through the book of Esther. But the king and his team there, they actually investigate this plot. They confirm that this plot is legitimate. And as a result, in verse 23, it says the rebels then were hung on a gallows. They were hung on a gallows. And that, we hear that. That brings up a picture in our mind of what that would look like. Not that we want to be graphic about it, but we think of something there. We think of the Old West Justice, don't we? Here we are in Texas. We think about Old West Justice right there. Hang 'em high sort of thing, right? That's what we think of. But actually the word translated gallows there just means a wood object, like a tree or a post. And so, when ancient justice was administered, they not only wanted to punish the person who was at guilt, but they also wanted to remind everyone else, what happens if you cross the government? If you cross, turn to a life of crime, turn to a life of rebellion, here's what's going to happen to you. So they wanted to make it very public. And that's what these gallows were. These gallows, actually what the Persians would use would be basically a post, and these people were impaled upon it. That's really grotesque to think about. Terrible way for someone to die. But this was a common form of corporal punishment for the Persians. In fact, Darius, one of the predecessors of King Ahasuerus, famously or infamously impaled 3,000 men on one occasion. So, this was something that they would do to put down rebellion and to make sure everyone knew you shouldn't be doing this. And so these men were not given a proper burial. They'd be left on those posts to rot on those posts until their bodies were gone, eaten by vultures and all that kind of disgusting stuff that would have happened. It was a very cruel and unglorious death, very public death, again as a warning to everyone else. But in the midst of all this, we've seen this hero emerge. We've seen Mordecai really come to the fore here. But now also we're going to see a villain emerges. If you look at chapter 3, Esther chapter 3, verse 1. It says, after these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So Haman is this villain that comes upon the scene now. And Haman, it says, is an Agagite. And, we see the various ites in the Old Testament. We recognize that they represent different people groups, different nations, and so forth. You think of, those of Canaan were the Canaanites and the Amorites and all these, the Jebusites, all these different groups, all these different ites out there. But Agag is not actually a nation. Agag is a person, is what Agag is. Agag was a title for the king of the Amalekites. And so Haman seems to have been of the royal family of the Amalekites, because saying that he's of Agag, the king of the Amalekites. Haman then becomes prime minister of Persia. That's really what his title is, how we would think of it, because he's second only to the king himself. In chapter 1, we saw that the king had these 7 princes around him, these advisors that he had in chapter 1, verse 14. Well, Haman is now above all those. Right, they're beneath him. He's their boss, as it were. Again, only the king himself is above Haman. In fact, the king commanded there in chapter 3, verse 2, that everyone, all these servants, are to bow to Haman as he comes by. And the historian Herodotus records this was a normal protocol in the Persian government. For them to bow like this to this ruler. And in fact, he goes on to say that in their society, if there are 2 officials and they are of equal rank, when they greeted each other, they were to kiss each other on the lips. I mean, that's kind of great, kind of crazy, isn't it? I think everyone wanted to work from home back then, probably too, right? So don't want to run into this guy that's on the same level as me. And if it was a lower ranking official, they were to kiss the higher one on the cheek as a sign of deference, to them, like, okay, this guy's above me, I'm going to kiss him on the cheek. And everyone else did this. They were to bow themselves. They were to prostrate themselves before these rulers. But our hero Mordecai, he refuses to bow. He's not going to bow to this guy. And that's our first sign in Mordecai of what looks like reverence for God. He doesn't say that. He doesn't come out with that. But it looks like that, doesn't it? It looks like some reverence for God. Even though he's been compromised, perhaps he's not forgotten that only God deserves our worship. And he won't bow to this man. Now, it is possible at the same time that he recognizes this man's an Amalekite and says, I'm not bowing to an Amalekite. That's possible too. That is possible. He doesn't really say, he just says, because I'm a Jew, I'm not going to bow to this guy. But this is also the event then that blows Mordecai's cover, doesn't it? He's been so careful to conceal his identity and his nationality, but when the servants ask why he won't bow, he tells them the truth. He says, it's because I'm a Jew. I'm not going to bow to this man. Isn't it amazing how our God sets up circumstances like this? Times in our lives that he gives us an opportunity to be a witness for him, to speak out for him, to be a light. There you are going about your normal day when all of a sudden it feels like there's a spotlight on you, you feel like, because here's an opportunity for you to be a witness for the Lord. There's that opportunity maybe to share the gospel or to speak up on some moral issue, to just let someone know that you're a Christian, in some way to take a stand. You have that opportunity that God brings into your life. And when that happens, there's that decision. Am I going to do what God's asking me to, or am I not going to do what God's asking me to do? And I think the key to that question is not to decide right then, but to decide ahead of time. Now, I'm going to do what God tells me to do, right? We decide that our life is the Lord's, and so when He wants us to speak, we will speak. When He wants us to act, we will act. We're going to do what He tells us to do. I think that really is the most effective way to be that consistent witness, is not to try and decide on the spot, but to have decided ahead of time. Now, we've probably all missed some opportunities like this, or maybe there's opportunities we've had and we feel like, we kind of stuck our foot in our mouth instead of really being a great witness. All these sorts of things can happen. None of us are perfect. But we put those things behind us and just pray for readiness for that next time. When God brings that spotlight, when God gives us that opportunity, that we take that opportunity and don't allow ourselves to be given over to the condemnation of the enemy who tries to keep us from being a witness because he makes us focus on maybe past failures. That's not from the Lord. That's definitely from the enemy. But Mordecai here refuses to bow, and now it's shared his nationality. And this all gets back to Haman the Amalekite. There's probably no people more hated by Haman than the Jews. He's filled with rage, it says, to the point of murder. And of course, rage is something we're all too familiar with in our society today. Multiple studies show that over 80% of Americans commit a road rage incident every year. Over 80%. Now, as believers, we can't allow our rage-filled world to rub off on us, right? We must resist that, because rage can turn even a hero into a villain. But let's look a little bit at the history of the Amalekites and the Jewish relations to understand why there'd be so much hatred by Haman of the Jews. The Amalekites were an ancient nation. We find them all the way back in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 14, they're one of the nations that gets conquered by those kings that also captured Lot. You might remember that in Genesis 14. I believe it was 3 kings that are going through the area and conquering, and as part of that, Lot has unwisely moved to Sodom, and he gets captured along with Sodom and all that. And then Abraham then leads a group that comes and rescues them. We go forward in the Bible to Exodus chapter 17, and in Exodus chapter 17, the Amalekites attack Israel as they're making their way to the Promised Land. This is that famous battle where when Moses, raises his hands, they win. When his hands lower, they start to lose. So Aaron and Hur on either side of him holding his hands up so the children of Israel will win. Now, not all the Amalekites die there. Some escape. But God pledges He's going to wipe them out at that point. He says right then, I'm going to wipe them out for what they did here. Well, we fast forward through time then to the time of Saul. So we move quite a bit forward to the time of Saul in 1 Samuel 15. And in 1 Samuel 15, this is another famous account in the Bible from the Old Testament that Saul is commanded to wipe out the Amalekites. God tells him specifically, not only the people, but even the animals, everything, scorched earth, nothing is left alive, basically, is what God commands him to do. Well, Saul doesn't obey. They kill many, but they definitely don't kill the animals. They brought them back as spoil. They didn't really obey. In fact, he brought the king back with him too. He didn't even put the king to death. And this is that account when God takes away the kingdom from Saul. He says, I'm going to give it to someone better than you. And soon after this, King David is anointed. Now, it's some period of time before Saul actually passes away. But that's what's going to happen, is David's going to take his place. But in this meeting where Saul was supposed to put to death the Amalekites and instead brought back King Agag with him, well, Samuel himself says, hey, he was supposed to be dead. And Samuel puts him to death. Samuel puts him to death right there. And so you can see how Mordecai's ancestor, because Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, not only a Jew, but also of the tribe of Benjamin. Mordecai is also of that tribe. Well, here his ancestor had a hand in the death of Haman's ancestor, King Agag. Right? So there might be some bitterness there, right, about all this, you can see. In 2 Samuel 1 then, and 2 Samuel is the last place we'll go for our history of the Amalekites here. There's an Amalekite that claims to have killed King Saul in 2 Samuel 1, and he thinks that's going to put him in good favor with King David. Maybe I'll have some position here in his cabinet because I killed his enemy. David instead puts him to death, says, how could you put to death the servant of the Lord like that? And David puts the Amalekite to death. And then finally in 2 Samuel 8, we see that the Amalekites are listed among nations that David in his reign has subdued now. So when you look at all that, you can see there's a lot of bad blood between Israel and the Amalekites, right? There's just a lot of bad blood there. And here Haman finds himself being wronged here by an Israelite again, by Mordecai. Haman, who's of royal blood. Haman, who, if he still had a nation, he might be king right now. And being of royal blood means nothing when you've got no nation, right? It doesn't really help him at all. And so Haman is looking for a way not just to hurt Mordecai in this, but all the Jews. He's looking for some revenge for himself and his people. And so let's look next at Haman's plot at verse 7. Esther 3, verse 7. It says, in the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, Pur, that is the lot, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month until the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all the other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. I'll stop there for now. So the first thing I see about his plot here is sort of the timing here and how he decides when he's going to bring his plan before King Ahasuerus. It says Haman cast the pur, or the pure there. That is a lot. Or we think of dice, right? To determine when should I approach the king. Now, these dice that they would have had, they wouldn't have had numbers on them like our dice do, but historians tell us they would have had prayers written on the different sides of them. So imagine it's much bigger than the typical die that you throw when you throw a pair of dice. And so we surmise from this that he was probably casting this, maybe even daily, as he's going to go see the king. Is this a day I should, go and bring my, my plan to him? No, not today. I'll try again tomorrow, sort of thing. And then when he finally gets the results that he's wanted, maybe he rolls the same thing 3 times. I don't know, 7 come 11, whatever. He gets something that tells him now's the time to go forward. And that was his confirmation. He goes forward to the king with this. Now, interestingly, this word Pur here is why the Jewish holiday is named Purim. It comes from that. We see that in chapter 9, verse 26. It tells us that. The next thing we see about his plot here is that it involves trickery, right? It involves trickery. Haman is pretty vague there in verse 8 about who he's talking about. Right? It says there's this people out here. He doesn't say who it is. He doesn't name the Jews. He just describes them the way he sees them, as these rebels that have their own laws and all this sort of thing. It's kind of as though he's afraid to say their name, right? He's afraid if he mentions them by name, maybe the king won't go with this. Maybe the king will decide against him if he actually calls out who the people are. Which should be a sign to Haman, right? That what you're doing is not the right thing. I mean, when you're afraid to tell the whole truth, it's a good sign that what you're doing is wrong, or you have the wrong motive in what you're doing, when you're trying to deceive like this for this plan. But again, we see the folly in Ahasuerus here, because we're going to see that Ahasuerus, he just trusts Haman in this implicitly. After all, he's, what's being talked about here by Haman is annihilating a race, right? That's a pretty serious issue he's talking about. And yet he doesn't even bother to look into who he's talking about, right? He lets him describe them in this vague way. We don't see in the rest of this chapter any investigation to find out if these things are true. I mean, when there was a plot against his own life, he made sure that, there was really something to this before he put those men to death. But here he's going to put a whole nation of people, a whole type of people to death without doing any investigation. We don't generally make our best decisions without information, do we? I mean, we need information to make a good decision. That's just sort of basic. It behooves us to find out a matter before we decide a course of action. And I think it's fair to say that, Ahasuerus here is blinded by his relationship with Haman. He's the one who appointed Haman to this high position. And so no doubt, this last year or so, he's been patting himself on the back for this decision. Man, this was such a great decision. Now, Haman takes care of all this stuff that I don't have to do anymore. He works with these princes and all that. I just talk to him. This is great. I love this. And so, this will sort of lessen his discernment, it lessens his discernment, I should say, about Haman's actions, right? Because he sees it as such a great decision, I put him in place there, and so he becomes less discerning about what's Haman doing. And after all, if Haman messes up, it really points back to Ahasuerus, doesn't it? That he made a mistake. What was I doing putting this man in such a powerful position? And this sort of failing is not unique to Ahasuerus. I think that whether it's laziness on our part sometimes, or pride, or whatever, sometimes we're tempted to be a little less discerning than we should be, especially with those close to us. We need to always have discernment. Because even those who love us the most, they can still make mistakes, right? I mean, no one is perfect except for Jesus. And so we don't want to enable somebody in their mistakes. We want to help them. If we discern there is, a wrong course of action, to point that out. Well, next, Haman, though, like the classic villain, he has a plot here that's going to involve some treachery also. Verse 9. I'll pick it up at verse 9. Haman continues, "If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put it into the king's treasuries." Then the king took a signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written just as Haman commanded to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and to the princes of each province according to its script, and each people according to its language, written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the people so that they could be ready for this day. The couriers went out impelled by the king's command while the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa, and while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. And so we read here, this is happening in the 12th year of Ahasuerus' reign. That's 5 years after marrying Esther. Just to give you an idea of how we're marching through time here. We saw that they got married. Now 5 years later, verse 7 said there it was in the 12th year of his reign. But further, this decree is going out in the first month of the year. The author points out this is the first month is Nisan in the Jewish calendar in verse 7 there. That is also the month of the Passover, which in our calendar is around March or April, depending on how it lands. And so just as the Jews would be celebrating God's deliverance in the Passover, this letter comes out. This order comes out. They're going to find out that they need God's deliverance once again, is what they're finding out. These letters are going out all over the kingdom, calling for their doom. Undoubtedly, this was the talk of the nation, right? Everyone would have had their attention on this. You can imagine some of the neighbors of the Jewish people sort of sizing up their property, thinking, "Oh yeah, I wouldn't mind having that. Wouldn't mind taking this that they own, or even having their home." This sort of thing. You can imagine that the Jews themselves are struggling too. What a terrible year for them. The letter goes out in the first month, but note that the genocide is to happen on the 13th day of the 12th month. And so that's basically about a year. That's in February, roughly, is when this would happen. And again, what a long year that must have been for the Jews of Persia. I mean, just that feeling like, wow, in a year they're going to wipe us out. Thinking of, again, their neighbors plotting their death. Everywhere they go, they would feel like they were marked now. And would they prepare their own defense? It seems as we read further in the book of Esther, maybe they weren't even allowed to defend themselves. And where would they go? They're in this huge nation. Roughly half of the world's population is under the control of Persia. Where are you going to go to get away from this? How are you going to go to get away from this? Well, the chapter concludes in verse 15 with the confusion that all this brings. Now, we hope that some of that confusion was because people didn't all agree with it, didn't think this was a right thing to be done. Here all the Jewish people were living amongst them. Certainly they had friends among those who were not Jewish who were living in the Persian kingdom also, right? And so what kind of position did that put them in? But then those who side with the Jews, they might face the ire of their fellow Persians, saying, well, what are you doing on their side? You should be on our side. How many times do we see that expression play out? The friend of my enemy is my enemy. People that think that way, and that would be the position they would find themselves in. And so it really was a situation where even those who wanted to kind of stay on the sidelines would be forced to have a position, right? And to be involved, even though they just want peace and they don't want this to happen. What evil has been set in place here? What treachery by Haman? It's undescribable or indescribable. And the king, rather than understanding what's happening, it tells us that he's sitting down to drink wine, right? He's like, hey, everything's great. He's just sitting down to drink wine with his friend Haman. In Proverbs 31, verses 4 and 5, Proverb 31, 4 and 5, it says, it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink. For they will drink and forget what is decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Well, we see that happening here, don't we? He's just having a good time there with his friend while he's giving out the order to slaughter all these innocent people. The position of leadership is, of course, a serious responsibility. Whether that's this person who's the king, whether that's a manager in a business, a teacher, a parent, someone who leads in the home, someone who leads in the church, these are serious responsibilities, and it requires diligence on the part of all of us who find ourselves in those places. We need to think about others and how conditions going on in our environment are affecting them, how decisions we make are affecting them. Now, clearly, all of us are to be thinking of others, aren't we? We have the golden rule. We're all to be thinking of others all the time. But the leader has the opportunity to make a bigger impact for good in the lives of other people. This is an opportunity that King Ahasuerus is squandering. He's actually doing the opposite of making life better for people. He's allowing people to be condemned to death for nothing other than being of a particular family of people, being the Jews. Well, next time we come together, we're going to see what happens as this plot becomes known to Mordecai and then also to Queen Esther, and how they become renowned heroes as a result, as they take action with the help of God. Let's close our time with prayer. Lord God, we thank you for your word that is so real. It is so real, Lord, and it speaks of just the evils that even happen in this world, evils that tragically are repeated as we see even today. Anti-Semitism on the rise in our country and in our world. Lord, we pray for the protection of the Jewish people. And we pray, Lord, for people to get saved so that they don't fall into these hateful schemes of the devil, but that they will love others and want what's best for others, and not God, that your word shows us these things and shows us just how wrong they are and how to live rightly. We pray as Christians that we would be examples to those around us, that we would be your lights in this world. You give us that boldness to speak, Lord, when you put that spotlight in our lives. Help us, Lord, to have faith in you and strength in you to speak up, Lord, and to speak your word. Lord, we thank you for that privilege we have to be your representatives, your ambassadors in this life. Help us, Lord, to see that as a serious role, and help us, Lord, to fulfill that role by your equipping.